Around 1330 BCE, the army commander Horemheb seized power for himself and became the new pharaoh of Egypt. When he did so, Horemheb was faced with a conundrum. He had already built a tomb for himself in the necropolis of Saqqara, but that was a relatively small monument, not suitable for the grandeur of a king. Thus, Horemheb was forced to start work on a new tomb. This monument, KV 57, is one of the most beautiful in the valley itself, but it's not open to the general public, and it was to my great fortune that I was able to visit this tomb in 2024. The live stream you are about to watch is an exploration of that monument. Just like his tomb at Saqqara, Horemheb's royal monument shows interesting innovations in artistic decoration and religious thought, and gives a glimpse at the society in which he lived. I hope you enjoy.
Okay. So that brings us to the royal tomb. I'm a little bit behind time, but that's usual. I knew I would talk long, so hopefully it's not too late for anybody. So the royal tomb is far to the south, far upriver, and it's in the Valley of the Kings. And we call it KV 57 because it is the 57th tomb in the counting system with which we number the monuments. I think by the time it was discovered in the early 1900s, this is when the tombs had started to become sequential. So what I mean is, when they first started classifying the tombs, there were several that were already visible. So, KV1, KV2, KV3, those don't necessarily go chronologically in terms of their discovery. It's just they were already visible. But by this point, they have started to become chronological. So KV 57 was discovered before KV 62, which is Tutankhamun. It was found by Edward Ayerton, who was working as part of the Theodore M. Davis expedition in the early 1900s. I've talked about Davis a few times on the podcast. He is easily the worst archaeologist to have ever worked in the Valley of the Kings. He's the one responsible for KV 55, the Amarna Cache burial, and the utterly horrendous documentation and preservation of that monument. Davis was the head of the expedition at the time, but he was kind of taking a back seat by this point, and Edward Ayerton was leading the workers themselves when they discovered KV 57, the tomb of Horemheb. Ultimately, it was Davis who got to publish it because he was the head of the group. It was his privilege, but it was actually Ayerton who found it. Well, technically, it was the Egyptian workers who found it, but they never get the credit because this was the early 1900s, and they often didn't even mention the Egyptian workers, except maybe the foremen or the reis. So Ayerton is the one who is remembered, unfortunately, but it was the Egyptian workers themselves. Anyway, the tomb might have actually been opened surreptitiously in the late 1800s. The archaeologist Geoffrey Martin, who worked on the Saqqara tomb, also did some work in KV 57. He did a lecture a couple of years ago for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I've put a link to here. It's on YouTube. And he mentions that when they first entered the tomb in 1907, there may have been some graffiti on one of the walls that suggested people had entered the monument as in the late 1800s. If so, it was obviously never reported, and nobody knew about the tomb. Perhaps a local family knew about it, but they had kept it buried or kept it sealed so that they could use it on their own initiative, kind of like what happened with the royal caches. But that's beside the point. The tomb itself is large, and it extends on a sort of north-south orientation deep into one of the hillsides of the Valley of the Kings. The main thing to note here is that Horemheb uses the straight tomb design, the straight axis. This was something that had been introduced by Akhenaten in his royal tomb at Amarna, and although they were abandoning so much of what Akhenaten had done, they did keep the straight axis design and continued to elaborate and develop it in subsequent generations. So Horemheb is the first tomb in the Valley of the Kings to use this particular style. You'll note, well, for those of you who are familiar, you might notice that it's almost an exact template or precursor for the tomb of Seti I, which is far more famous, far better understood, far more visited by people. But if I go back and forth, Horemheb, same essential design with the staircases and corridors going down to the well shaft. Then we have a small pillared hall. This is Seti's one, which Seti adds an extension, but Horemheb doesn't have that. Small pillared hall, and then the axis breaks, and the staircase carries on down, slightly off the center. Same thing for Seti, going down, down, down. And then we get to the antechamber, and then the burial chamber, which is divided into two sections, a raised area with pillars, and a lowered area with the sarcophagus. Same thing with Seti, although this particular line drawing doesn't show the sarcophagus area that well. You can see that the two tombs are basically the same in their major components, and given the time scale involved here, you know, even if you give Horemheb a long reign of 30 years, chances are the same people were designing this tomb as were designing this one, or at the very least, the master architect of Horemheb, his apprentice, probably designed the tomb of Seti I. So they're following the same tradition. The tomb of Ramesses I that comes in between them is completely different, but that's because of time and shortness. So now I'm going to just run you quickly through a little visual tour of the tomb, because KV57 is not usually open to the public, so many of you may not have seen it. And I was very lucky to get to visit it early this year on one of our tours. We got permission for Horemheb. It's not easy to do and it's not cheap, but we got it. And you'll see some photos and videos from that, from myself and from some of the guests who were on the tour. If there's any of you in the audience, hello, hope you're doing well. So we start at the exterior, running down, literally unsealing the tomb. The tomb doors are padlocked, of course, but they're also wired shut, and that wire is sealed with a small, kind of like a clay or metal stamp that is impressed with the signature of the inspector who was responsible for the security of this particular tomb. Basically the same system that the ancients used. It's sealed with like a wire or a rope, and then it's pressed with his mark, so they know that if it gets broken, it was under his authority, so he's the one responsible for the security. Heading down the first corridor towards the staircases, this is our wonderful guide, Salah, who is really excellent. He has run several tours for us, and he's super knowledgeable, super enthusiastic, and super helpful. So I like to include him where I can. Salah's great. And then we come to the first famous parts of the tomb, which is the decorated well shaft. The first corridors, like this A, B, C, and D, Horemheb doesn't have decorations in these. Later tombs, like Seti I, they do have decoration, but up until then, these tend to get left blank, kind of like just, they're not the important part of the tomb, they're not the part that requires decoration. The decoration usually, up until before Seti I, starts here in chamber E, which is the well shaft. What we have is Horemheb, obviously, standing before, in this case, Aset or Isis. I'm starting to use Aset more frequently than Isis because it's getting. I'm trying to get the names of the gods closer to their ancient Egyptian original as the podcast develops, but also, unfortunately, that particular terrorist group, ISIS, has kind of ruined the word in the modern audience perception. So I've tried to start emphasizing Aset or Isis. She wears her characteristic emblem, which is the throne, the set, which you can interpret as a place or the seat of power. Can mean different things. The king is accompanied by one of the forms of Horus. In this particular case, I think it's Horus, the son of Isis. Yes, it's Horus, the son of Isis, one of the avatars of Horus. There are several by this point, and they lead the king. He leads the king deeper into the tomb. So in these well shafts, you will always find that the king is walking towards the burial chamber. He's walking into the monument. The idea, quite simply, is that as you're going deeper into the tomb, you are entering, symbolically, the duat, the afterlife. And since this is the place of the king's burial, he is always entering that. So anytime you see the king in these particular chambers, he should be walking deeper into the tomb. And that actually is quite a helpful way if you find a photo of one of these monuments out of context and doesn't have, good explanation or caption. If you know the direction that the king is going, you can make a fair guess what wall this is appearing on. If he's going left, it's probably on the right wall. If he's going right, it's probably on the left wall. This is the next section of the scene I just showed. Go back. So the king's here, standing before Hathor, and then we have Hathor herself, and then Osiris, and then Horus, Anubis, and Osiris facing towards the doorway that goes deeper into the tomb. The monument of Horemheb is not in the best condition, unfortunately. This is partly due to the quality of the bedrock. It's a really soft kind of shale in certain sections here, like deep sort of veins of shale that have led to this really badly damaged state of some of the art. Some of it's survived quite well, but other parts have not, unfortunately. This is the pillared hall, which is the one that I pointed out to you earlier. Seti I has a really nice version of these with 4 pillars and elaborate decoration all on the outside, and then with a little extension just off this part. Horemheb's tomb, like so many royal tombs, is unfinished in its decoration, so it doesn't have anything here. And you can see that even the walls are still rough. They haven't been properly smoothed and finished up just yet. No, wrong way. Come on. All right. So this is a video by Tom, who took it in the Tomb of the Kings. Hi, Tom, if you're watching. The reason I've included this is so you can get a sense of how the room is laid out, but also the nice thing about this video is that it captures the raised relief decoration of the tomb. So what they've done is, instead of carving the figures into the wall, they have carved the wall itself back around the figures and around the hieroglyphs. And that gives the art a really fine quality definition, and it really makes it literally stand out from the background. It is a very laborious, time-consuming, expensive way to decorate the tomb, and it probably took up most of the time spent on this particular monument. But this video captures some of that quite nicely, with the light kind of playing off the figures. And then I think So then we carry on around back to the other wall. This is a figure of Nefertem, I believe, Osiris. It's either Hathor or Isis. Hathor, there we go. Anyway, you get the idea. Really beautiful decoration on the monuments. Really fine carving and really beautifully preserved coloring on all of the figures. And again, the king is always heading towards the tomb itself. Okay. This is the burial chamber with the sarcophagus of the king. Okay, and we are looking northward right now. So we're looking towards the North Star, the circumpolar stars, which, if you remember the pyramid texts episodes I did earlier this year, the circumpolar stars are the stars above the northern horizon that, because of the angle or tilting of the Earth, it's not up and down. The Earth rotates on an angle. There's a certain cluster of stars around the North Pole that are always visible in the sky, no matter the time of year. They never dip below the horizon. The Egyptians obviously noticed this. They were very keen astronomers. They had thousands of years, literally, of experience and storytelling around the stars and the constellations. They developed an idea that these stars that never disappeared were undying. They never perished. And they called them the imperishable stars. And that was closely connected with the realm of Osiris, with the world of the afterlife deities. Osiris had overcome death. He had become imperishable or undying. So his realm was not necessarily physically, but to some degree symbolically in that world, in that part of the sky. And for that reason, we often find Osiris specifically on the northern wall of a tomb, or at least referenced in the north, because part of his kingdom or part of his immortality takes place in that realm. The king's body would have been lying this direction, east on our right, west. No, sorry. Scratch that. Lying the other way, with his head pointing towards the west, so that he is ready to journey into the west. Brain fart there. So that brings us kind of to the end of the visible part of the tomb. There are these doorways here and another couple off to the left and right, which carry on to these smaller chambers. Chances are, if Horemheb had lived longer, the tomb would have carried on expanding and extending deeper into the underworld, if you will. But because he died after 16, maybe 27 years, the monument is very much unfinished. Which, to be fair, every single royal tomb is unfinished to some degree. There is always a section that doesn't have completed decoration or doesn't have any decoration at all, or some chamber that is not finished. And I'm fairly confident that's intentional, not because they want their tomb to look unfinished, like a sloppy work in progress, but because they don't want to finish the tomb. They want to keep expanding it, either because they can, because I'm living longer, why not make my tomb more fancy? Or, I suspect, I have no proof of it, but I suspect that there might have been a bit of a taboo around having your tomb ready and waiting for you too early. So rather than complete everything and then what's left to do but die, you keep expanding it as much as you can. Keep adding new rooms and then only do the decoration towards the end when it is clear that you are reaching the finale of your life. But again, that's beside the point. Horemheb's tomb is very large, not as large as Seti I's. He manages to do the same amount as Horemheb and then extend slightly further on and also complete a beautiful style of decoration. But to be fair, Horemheb's tomb is the first of its kind in terms of this. Straight axis, very highly developed architecture, going all the way down into the monument, and then with the raised relief decoration on top. There's a lot of things going on here architecturally and artistically that probably would have been quite challenging to achieve at the time. A couple decades later, under Seti I, they are much more skilled and competent at that particular program, so they're able to achieve more quicker. I suppose a good comparison might be to how in the Old Kingdom we had Djoser build the step pyramid. Took about 20 to 25 years maybe, but it's not the largest pyramid, it's not the most impressive. It's beautiful, I love it, but it's not the biggest. Then you get the King Sneferu, who through maybe 40 to 45 years of rule is able to complete at least 2, maybe 3 pyramids. And then that culminates in the reign of Khufu, who in the span of about 25 to 27 years is able to complete the Great Pyramid. These things develop over generations. You know, the skill builds up to a point that they are able to do masterpieces, and then that peak kind of slowly fades off as those people die or as resources get allocated elsewhere. Similar thing might have happened with Horemheb. Akhenatans, artists and architects, pioneer the straight axis tomb. They do it on a much smaller scale than Horemheb does. You know, the royal tomb at Amarna just isn't as big as this, and it has different side chambers and configurations. Horemheb's architects take that, what they've achieved, they expand on it, elaborate on it, but they're still not able to fully master it. And then under Seti I, we get the peak, where it's like they can build the size and they can build the precision and the detail, and they can achieve that. And then after that, it starts to decline again. Ramesses II, his tomb is nowhere near as nice as Seti I, even though he reigned for way longer than any of these people. And even his son Meneptah has a nice tomb, which is in the vein of Seti I, but it's clear that by that point, the resources had been allocated to other things, and that skill ceiling of the master craftsman had started to dip again. So these things kind of snowball over the course of 1 or 2 human lifetimes as the experience and the skill builds. Okay, that kind of brings me in a way back to the sort of key point of the whole talk, or the whole presentation, is that Horemheb's monuments, both at Saqqara and the Valley of the Kings, they really bridge an artistic and architectural divide between the 18th and 19th dynasties. The things that come before Horemheb are very different than the things that come after Horemheb in some key respects, some key elements. And I think his reign is not underappreciated among Egyptologists, but is certainly underappreciated in the wider public as to how much of a pivot point his reign is in terms of these things, or his lifetime, I should say, because the Saqqara tomb is happening before his reign. So let's talk about religion, for example. Horemheb, as famously, is one of the ones who brings the Egyptian religion back to its orthodox status after Akhenaten had done his whatever he was doing. Horemheb does not include Atenism in his Saqqara tomb. He does include references to the deity, Aten, but the sun disk with the hands, that iconography that Akhenaten had used, that's gone. It's back to traditionalism, back to the classic deities. We do get texts that convey some of the ideas of Akhenaten, though. The most notable one is that Ra-Horakhti, Ra, the ruler, Horus of the two horizons, remains the supreme deity. Although, there's an idea that after Atenism, it went back to Amun-Ra. In Saqqara in the north, Ra-Horakhti is still very much the supreme deity, and that pretty much is always the case. We talk about Amun or Amun-Ra because Thebes or Waset is so well preserved, but in the north it's really Ra-Horakhti. But anyway, under Akhenaten, and slightly to a lesser extent under his father Amunhotep III, the religion of Ra-Horakhti specifically had expanded to include this idea that he was the sole god, the Netcherwa, and that he was the ruler of all things, and including the earth, the sky, and the afterlife, or Duat. And also that he was the ruler of all peoples. We see this in hieroglyph texts that describe Ra-Horakhti ruling over every land, and all people come on their bellies before you to praise you, that kind of thing. Akhenaten takes that to its extreme with the very literal interpretation of the sun disk as the universal and sole deity. After Akhenaten, the idea doesn't go away. It actually sticks around. I think it reflects the idea that whatever was happening with Ra-Horakhti, Akhenaten did not start that. He simply took it to its extreme, but those ideas were already percolating in the theology or in the wider society. He simply expanded on them. To bring it back, there's no images of Aten in Horemheb's tomb, but he does reference Aten. The best example comes from the stela, this is a copy, the original's in the British Museum, which is in the front courtyard of the Saqqara tomb. You don't have to read all this, but it includes references to Ra as the mouth of every person. He feeds everybody on the earth, and that he is rejuvenated as the Aten, as the sun disk. Pardon me. And that he is the sort of overlord of all of the earth and the Duat and the afterlife and the sky. And this is very much Amarna or post-Amarna religious ideology that is still percolating in Horemheb's time. Horemheb is displaying it in a very traditional manner. He's got Ra-Horakhti as the falcon-headed human with his sun disk. We've got Jehuti or Thoth again. We've got Ma'at. All these deities who, at least visually, were downplayed in the reign of Akhenaten. They're back. And Horemheb runs with that in the classic sense. Just to go back, we have a nice image of, this is the same column, it's just wrapped around The two halves, you can see, pardon me, you can see Horemheb kneeling before the god Atum, the great god, the demiurge, the creator of northern theology. So very much back to the traditional style, even if those ideas of the universal Ra Horakti and the shining Aten, those are sticking around. It's even more pronounced in the royal tomb. There are no explicit references that I'm aware of to Aten himself, but again, the ideas do carry on. The most notable example is that Horemheb's royal tomb introduces the Book of Gates. Again, I covered this pretty thoroughly on the podcast, but one of the main themes within the Book of Gates is that Ra Horakti is the universal ruler of all peoples. And the Book of Gates even includes images that show Ra Horakti, or Horus, ruling over the different tribes or races, if you will, who live within the world. So that traditionalism is, I guess the way you would say it is that the traditionalism that Horemheb shows in his Saqqara tomb is kind of refined further and expanded further in his royal tomb. You know, the ideas that Akhenaten had introduced, they're here to stay in some respects. You can't uncap that bottle, but those themes can be refined, and Horemheb does that with the Book of the Gates, or whoever wrote the Book of Gates, whoever composed it, does that. This is that northern scene that I showed you before, and it's kind of the heart of the Book of Gates, is the crux, and that is the judgment hall of Osiris. The other thing to note about post-Amarna religion, and Horemheb's tomb is a really good example of this, is that Osiris gets a kind of a bump in visibility after Akhenaten. One thing that we can say about sort of 18th dynasty tomb art generally is that Osiris is not as prominent as you would expect. He does appear, like for sure, he's still important, obviously, he's still the king of the dead. But in terms of the art, in terms of what they're showing in their tomb chapels or their monuments, Osiris doesn't appear as often as you would expect in that kind of context. After Akhenaten, whole different ballgame. Osiris is suddenly everywhere, especially in the Saqqara tombs, but also down in Waset and Thebes. Suddenly he's a big business. He's a big deal. There's a couple of different interpretations as to why this might be. The most obvious one is that the collective trauma of what Akhenaten had tried to do led to a revivalism in Osiris worship, or at least a revivalism in his visible prominence. You know, people were so frustrated by Akhenaten's extreme ideas that they turned back to Osiris in a big way. That is one possible interpretation. Another one could be, I suspect, and it might be a bit of both, is that because the idea of Ra Horakti as the universal ruler is developing, that kind of goes hand in hand with Ra Horakti in the underworld. And one of the roles of Osiris in the underworld is to be an avatar of Ra Horakti. Not the same god, they do combine in some ways, but he's not the same god, but he is part of Ra Horakti, an aspect of him in some religious texts. And that includes the Book of the Gates, in which this scene appears. Horemheb's tomb is, to the very best of my knowledge, the first tomb that shows this judgment hall of Osiris. Obviously, it's become incredibly famous because of the Book of the Dead, belonging to people like Ani, who show really elaborate and famous scenes of the judgment hall. But this particular version of it, with Osiris enthroned, the scales that weigh the heart and the feather, and then a procession of people, Horemheb's tomb is the first to include this, because it belongs specifically to the Book of the Dead. And basically what it seems to capture is the idea that Osiris, as king of the dead, fulfills the underworld duties that Ra Horakti undertakes on earth. He judges all people, all races, all things, and his power is concentrated in the Duat. And in that sense, he is in some ways another version of Ra, again, it's sort of getting into this idea that Ra-Horakti has become the sole god, the universal god. And in the Book of Gates, there is some debate about it. We get a sense that Osiris himself, in some ways, has become an aspect or version of Ra-Horakti, simply the Ra-Horakti who rules in the Duat. Again, very big discussion, but that's an interesting pivot point, which the Tomb of Horemheb is this theological question of what is the status of these individual gods? Are they being perceived as versions of the same universal God, or are they manifestations of him in different bodies and forms? It's a really tangled and complicated question, but a lot of it hinges on the Book of Gates and Horemheb's tomb. Okay, so I'll quickly run through the artistic question as well. I realize it's quite late in the evening for some of you, so I'll try not to talk too much longer. But one of the things that Horemheb's monuments are really great for is the artistic quality. I mentioned it earlier that they have this raised relief style where instead of carving the figure out of the wall, as you might do in many tombs, they cut the wall itself back around the figure. So they draw the outline, they refine that, do their final version, and then they start chiseling around it, kind of like cutting out on construction paper. Horemheb did not invent this style. It had existed since the Old Kingdom, but he brought it back in a big way in his Saqqara tomb and his royal tomb specifically. Actually, in the background of my video, you can see some of that raised relief in the Old Kingdom tomb of Mereruka. So there you go. Horemheb makes it like a cornerstone of his artistic style. Really nice example are these blocks, which are now in Leiden, which again show him as an interpreter, speaking through the translator who talks to foreigners. Again, the wall itself, or the block, has been carved back around the outline of these figures. So it really stands out, when the light hits it just right, you get the really nicely defined edges, and overall, it's just a much higher quality, or it gives a roundedness to the figures that you just don't get in sunk relief. No matter how good the sunk relief is, raised relief is just a little bit better at giving that lifelike, three-dimensional, rounded appearance. You can see this old photo, you get a really nice idea of the contrast. The edges of the kilt stand out beautifully, each side of the arm. To be fair to the sunk relief style, where you're cutting into the wall, sunk relief is much better for contrast. It's much better when the shadows are hitting. Raised relief doesn't give you that as well. Raised relief really benefits from close examination, from being up, looking at it very finely. That's where it really shines, whereas sunk relief is better for large images from a distance because it tends to capture the shadows much more evocatively. But the very best examples, of course, are from the royal tomb. In this case, you have the king's profile, even his uraeus just stands out in absolutely magnificent detail. It's not perfect, to be clear. Like, you can see, if you look closely, the paint on the background, the blue, has come up slightly onto the king's nose. This might have been refined if they had another pass at the tomb. All of that might have been corrected, but possibly not. But you see it quite nicely here in the cartouches. Look at the very fine lines on the setep symbol. It stands out beautifully on the white background because it's in raised relief. You just don't get this with sunk. The downside is that it takes so much longer. It requires very small and fine chiseling to get every little bit perfectly. If you screw up, there's much less wiggle room for correction. So everything has to be precise and really perfectly done. Obviously, it's not perfectly done. You can always see there's like the line on the red crown is not perfectly painted. There's always little blips and glitches here and there, but the raised relief does give you truly exquisite detail in the small features. I've only just noticed that the edges of the water hieroglyph have been left white. I wonder if that's intentional because they've done the same thing between the legs of the duck. Maybe that helps it stand out so it's more legible. But I also wonder if just the artist didn't finish going into those little bits before they stopped. Anyway. Pardon me. Another thing that's great about Horemheb's tomb is that it is unfinished in a very specific way. There is a certain and very clearly defined point at which the artists stopped working, at which they put down their tools or packed them up and left, never to return. That probably happened, around the day of the funeral or shortly thereafter. But you can see basically they've done their draft sketches, first in red, which is the underlying layer. Then it's been corrected by the master draftsman in black. Then down here, they've started the carving, figuring out. The guy's got through in between these two, and he's started the edges of that. He's obviously just about to start going into there when he stops. The people who are working behind him have started doing the white layer of plaster, to sort of just to fill it in, to provide the baseline, which will then be given its greater definition with these paintings. So this is what becomes that. And I just love looking at this tomb. When I got to see it in person earlier this year, it was really, really magical because you can almost reach out and touch that exact moment where the artist stopped working and they left, never to return. And it's just frozen there, literally in stone. It's really wonderful. Same thing here on this right-hand image. We get a very nice sense of the definition from the raised relief, even carving around the little blip here. They've gone up to the underside of this hieroglyph, and then they've stopped because the king is buried now. Work has to cease on the tomb. We have to seal it. We have to bury it. The image is there. The image is legible. It's all there as we need it. Too late. Can't finish it. Goodbye. But it's great. We benefit from the unfinished state of Horemheb's tomb because we learn so much about the process of decoration from that. Finally, just to sort of compare and contrast, this is the tomb of Thutmose IV, which again I got to visit the first time earlier this year. This is from the well chamber, that chamber E, the well shaft. Again, the king is walking deeper into the tomb, but you can just see, this is only 60 years before Horemheb. Very different style. Even the exact features of the figures are different, but it's plaster, it's flat painting, it's almost like a cartoon, if you will. And for somebody like Seti I, this would have been the cartoon version before they do the actual carving. But for Thutmose IV, this was the completed decoration. But you get a sense of just, I don't mean this as a negative, but just the flatness of the figures that results from the paint on plaster style. It's very beautiful, nicely contrasted, very colorful, but you just don't get that definition that you get from carved wall reliefs. Same thing with Amenhotep III. The colors on this are a little bit skewed, and this whole chamber has been terribly damaged, but you get that same sense of the flatness, the sort of cartoony element of it that is conveyed through the paint on plaster technique. Compare that with Horemheb, night and day, almost literally. Just the way the raised relief stands out from the wall, even if we're looking at it flat, flat here, straight on here, it's just so much better detailed, so much finer, just from that little or that extreme effort of carving the wall back around it. Raised relief doesn't even have to be that high to create this kind of effect, but it does take a long time. It does require a great deal of skill. And then that, again, like I was saying earlier, that reaches its pinnacle with Seti I, where the artists have really mastered the art of doing this. And in this panel, which is in the Louvre now, you get the very fine detailing on the figures themselves. They stand out beautifully. Look at Seti and Hathor's wig. Nothing like it anywhere else. This is the peak of what they were able to achieve. And I would say they could only achieve this because they had the trial run on Horemheb's tomb, which got close but was never finished. with Seti I, they pull it off. So finally, talk about some burials and some legacies. So the Saqqara tomb, Horemheb never used it for his own burial, obviously. Once he became king, he did actually carry on using the tomb for a while after he became king. His artists went back to the monument and added cobra serpents to all of his images, uraeus, to make him into a king. And this, I suspect, might have actually been the situation for several years while he was busy with other things. But at a certain point, they decided, this is not going to do. We need to go back to the valley and start work on what became KV-57. Before they did that, or at least before that tomb was ready, they did bury the king's wife, Mut Nojmet. At least we're pretty sure it's her. Her skeleton was found in one of the burial chambers of Horemheb's tomb, amongst artifacts and objects that pointed to a late 18th dynasty burial, so it wasn't intrusive, it wasn't later. She probably died in her mid-30s to early 40s, and probably in pregnancy or childbirth. So chances are she was trying to give Horemheb an heir, but she did not succeed in doing that. In KV-57, the mummy of Horemheb himself has never been discovered, or at least never been identified. There were fragments of several mummies actually found in the tomb during the clearance and restoration of it. But from this kind of image, you can see the state of KV-57 when it was first opened. It was full of debris, partially from the carving of the monument, like chiseling the walls out. They just hadn't had time to clean it. And partly from the roof collapsing. These are chunks from the roof. Again, it's that sort of soft shale that I kind of mentioned in some areas. Not strong enough to support a good roof, especially if there's flooding or earthquakes. Sections of it had collapsed. One thing you may notice in this photo is this wooden Osiris bed. One of these was found in the tomb of Tutankhamun, and several of them have come from later tombs as well. Basically, it's a wooden frame in which you place earth and seeds to plant them, and then they will sprout through these holes, which are here, and they will give Osiris the image of new life, basically. It's a little planter box in the shape of Osiris, but that was discovered in Horemheb's tomb, broken, now restored. They also found Horemheb's canopic jars on the right, wooden statue of Anubis, just like was in the tomb of Tutankhamun. Panther, same thing. Tutankhamun had one of those. I think he had a couple, actually. Very, very typical late 18th dynasty burial style and artifacts. Chances are Horemheb had some similar items to that of Tutankhamun. It might not have been the same amount of lavish as Tutankhamun's, because some of Tutankhamun's items were repurposed from earlier generations, but Horemheb's tomb might have been quite impressive when fully stocked. The last question is that Horemheb's tomb might originally have had a royal cache. So next, outside the tomb, next to the doorway, or just inside it, there is graffiti from the later period when the high priests of Thebes were going around and collecting the royal mummies, removing them from their tombs because they had become aware of the robberies and the devastation. One of them, a man named Buter Amun, was one of the leaders of this process. He visited Horemheb's tomb, and he left a graffito marking his visit, that he had inspected the monument, and that he had... The word itself is a little bit unclear. It's either that he had removed from the tomb of Horemheb, or that he had reburied in the tomb of Horemheb. So there is some possibility that Horemheb's tomb was used as a cache, or at the very least as a temporary cache, as part of the reburial process. They bring a bunch of mummies into the tomb to keep them safe for a while, and then when they are ready to take them to the ultimate burial place in the actual caches, that's when they remove them. Another point in favor of that is that Horemheb's tomb is right next door to the tomb of Amenhotep II, KV-35, which did have a royal cache. There are two. There's one from Deir al-Bahari, the famous one, The second one is from the tomb of Amenhotep II, which is just up the hill from Horemheb, like 20 meters. The third point that suggests the idea there may have been a cache here is that just next to Horemheb's tomb, a small kind of pit or shaft tomb was discovered, which is now known as KV 58. It was found just after Horemheb, and that contained treasures or trinkets from the tomb of Ay, which is weird because Ay's tomb is in the next valley over, the West Valley, completely different burial site, completely different area. But some of his treasures were here. You could argue that maybe they had been deposited there by robbers who were keeping them in a storage cache until they could use them. But another, perhaps more likely interpretation is that Ay himself had been removed from his tomb and brought to KV 57, and some of his smaller items were buried in that little shaft for safekeeping, or for somebody to come back and get them later, if you will. Again, very uncertain. It would be terribly ironic, given what Horemheb did to the memory of Ay, if ultimately Ay's mummy did wind up in the burial chamber of Horemheb for safekeeping. That would be poetic justice that I would find very, very amusing. But to cap that off, when archaeologists first entered this tomb, they did find traces of at least 4 mummies, bits of bodies that suggested at least 4 individuals had laid here at one point or another. Now, unfortunately, because this was a Davis excavation, that all of that information is not well documented. We don't know most of the details on those particular mummies. So it's entirely possible they were fragments that had been buried here later in an intrusive burial, but they might have been part of a cache, a royal cache, perhaps, possibly including the mummy of Horemheb himself, but also Ay and anyone else who was brought into this monument. It's a big question mark. There's a lot of uncertainty over it, which is why, we only talk about the 2 royal caches that are definitively proven. This one is just tentative. It might have existed, but we're not entirely sure. But that does bring me to the end of this these particular stories. It's a really interesting and sort of curious capstone on Horemheb's legacy. He might have been the 3rd royal cache with some of those figures who are now lost. That would be nice if that had been the case, if we could ever find proof of it. That would certainly tie up some loose ends on what happened to these certain individuals who are now missing. If they were here and subsequently destroyed or lost, that would at least be a explanation. So here we have KV 57 as it was found. This is looking northwest. If you're kind of taken from over here in the bottom right of this photo and looking that way, because you can see the bottom of the hall, the Judgment of Osiris, just over here. But you can see how much collapse had been, how much debris was washed into the monument from flooding. Nowadays, it's very nice, very well cleaned up. Nice wooden floor. All of these side chambers are closed off, so people can't get into them. There's nothing really to see in there anyway, but it's good to have some security on them.